it's great that we have history on the agenda, so thank you to our organisers for that. I'm going to be talking about the prehistory of veganism, really. So I'm going to be discussing my research into the history of vegetarians and other animals in Britain between the sort of mid-19th century and the 1930s. And the tentative title of my doctoral research, Creeds of Kinship, is an homage to the title of the final work of my subject, Henry Salt. And in my use, it refers to how my research seeks to combine an embodied animal history with an intellectual history of human-animal relations. Salt was the longest living of my subjects, and Creeds of Kinship, published in 1935, represents the closing of the curtain, perhaps of the sort of long Victorian history of animal ethics and vegetarianism, before we then see, of course, the emergence of veganism and the Oxford group of vegetarians in the 60s and 70s, most obviously Peter Singer, of course. And this other photograph on the slide is of Kate Salt and a rook that the Salts fostered in North Wales whilst hiking, just one of the encounters I discuss in the thesis, and I might return to that if I have time at the end. So my plan today is to briefly introduce my subjects and research, but then I'd like to spend a little bit of time pointing towards why this history might have some sort of resonances with current discussions in veganism. And these are very tentative thoughts that I'll be sort of exploring as I go, so any feedback at the break will be welcome. So my first subject is the aforementioned Salt, a junior eater master turned socialist and vegetarian, whose biography was given the dismissive label of the faddist's progress in a Times review. He was also one of the organisers behind the Humanitarian League, a friend of Gandhi and Bernard Shaw. And next we have Anna Kingsford, a singularly fascinating vegetarian and anti-vivisectionist who was amongst the first cohort of British women to earn a medical degree in 1880 from Paris. She was also a theosophist engaged with writing esoteric religious works and a spiritualist also. And then we have Edward Carpenter, probably the most well-known of the three. He's a poet-philosopher sort of moulded in the Walt Whitman form, if anyone knows. Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, this long prose poem, sort of bringing a bodily engagement back to nature. Carpenter sort of anglicised Whitman in his own prose poem Towards Democracy in the 1880s. And he had sort of a renaissance posthumously in the 70s and 80s when the sort of new generation of social historians found his work on homosexuality to be relevant for gay liberation. And he's sort of being rediscovered now as well as a sort of a forerunner in the history of sort of eco-criticism and ecological poetics and sort of more-than-human politics. So as I say, what my research seeks to do is to build upon traditional histories of vegetarianism, as you can see on the screen, which generally be in either social, cultural, or intellectual histories, and bring animals into the conversation. And this allows me to ask questions about how human-animal encounters and broader periods of living alongside animals might have affected the intellectual thought of my subjects. And my change in approach has been precipitated by the influence of works such as these from animal historians and also by Salt himself. So I do this through an animal-human biographical approach, as recent work in this area has shown, and Kim's work as well has been an influence. This form of research can account for the individuality of animals without attempting to reconstruct the lived experiences of the animals themselves necessarily. And this accords with the sentiment uttered by Salt in his own book of animal biographies, The Story of My Cousins from 1923, where he writes, quote, "A sympathetic acquaintance with non-humans brings with it the conviction that they are persons, not things, sentient and in their proper degree rational fellow beings, with feelings and affections closely akin to our own." And so this sort of led me to follow this approach and with research questions such as these. Yeah, so these are some of the recent works in animal human biography that have sort of precipitated this, direction of research. How does this work in practice? Well, to take a quick look at Anna Kingsford on screen might be illustrative. We don't know a whole lot about her childhood because she died early at the age of 41, and unlike my other subjects, she never wrote about her childhood in a memoir. What we have been left is this photograph of the young Annie and her pig, as the caption says in the Shropshire Archives. And when finding this photograph, I was both excited and unsurprised, because there's clear evidence elsewhere that she kept guinea pigs as an adult. But this childhood connection meant that it was a lifelong association. And this broader meaning that the broader meaning that this relationship had is bound up with Victorian contexts of human-animal relations. For example, the proliferation of pet keeping that Hamlet and Strange have recently written about in their book Pet Revolution, and also the so-called human dilemma that Keith Thomas described in the sort of 17th, 18th century, about a sort of confused state of mind brought about by industrialization and modernization, wherein a self-enriching manipulation and exploitation of the natural world butted up against instincts to conserve it and protect it. And then also this inspired as well the animal historian Susan Nance, her idea of an animal modernity, wherein animals were subjected to habitat loss and commodification in a global capitalist system, but also wherein humans projected their own subjectivities onto animals. And, for example, in Diana Donald's book as well, as sort of gendered two religions of enmity for sort of masculine ideas of hunting, and then amity for women sort of getting involved with the animal protection movement. And so the young Kingsford, her relationship with the guinea pigs was sort of bound up in all of these different contexts. And from her juvenilia, including both poetry and prose fiction, we find that she responded to these through an intense, highly emotive Christian mysticism. It was almost pantheistic in how she described birds as nature's poets, whose wondrous strength is the pure element of open heaven. And this was an element she took forward into her later theosophical writing, part of which argued that non-human animals had souls just as humans do. And so I posit that these sorts of childhood relations with animals, in Kingsford's case guinea pigs, had the capacity to inform later intellectual works, including works on vegetarianism. And you could say then that my subjects were not necessarily born vegetarians, but became vegetarians in part through their association with other animals. And so I want to sort of use the rest of my time now to talk about how some sort of tentative sort of grasping towards conclusions that might be of interest to current day vegans. So let's start with the good, shall we? The first thing to say is that for my subjects, vegetarianism was actually more than a diet. And in this sense, it might be justifiably understood that they were proto-vegan. Their vegetarianism was a way of being with the world and with animals. An attention to animals extended beyond their plate and pantries and into the world of fashion, pets, zoos, hunting, vivisection, and other realms. So we should then, as vegans, remember and harken back So the prehistory of our movement, not as something that is lesser and prior, but actually as something that is constitutive of and integral to. The concerns of the vegan were the concern of the Victorian vegetarian, at least some of them. For example, thinking about these human-animal relations, Henry Salt's conception of companion animals as cousins is illustrative of this sort of vegan lifestyle or philosophy. In a sort of post-Darwinian flourish, he writes that, quote, "To me, the faith of the future lies in the assurance of a universal kinship, and the only real infidelity is the denial of that renovating creed. What is democracy itself but the gradually spreading perception of affinities, the knowledge that in spite of external divergence, all classes and all peoples, including animals, are ultimately one?" And elsewhere he writes, quote, "Let not the reader suppose that these cousins of mine were mere playthings and, quote, pets. For I look upon the keeping of pets as at best a degradation of animals and a denial of the respect which is their due." Is it really too much then to describe Salt as a sort of early forerunner of a Zoopolis-style animal politics, with his sentience as a democratic principle and non-human animal companions as cousins, perhaps even a vegan politics? In the same work, Salt contemplates the diet of his feline cousins. He praises master, a tabby she-cat, for possessing a pacific character, whilst admonishing her playfully for not following the full Tolstoyan doctrine to the letter. Salt's remedy seems to be to grant master independence. He offers her vegetarian food, placed upon the table in democratic fashion, but then allows her to follow her instincts and hunt outside if she must. And this is Salt's understanding of cousinhood as a more liminal form of companionship, perhaps, where the human and the non-human are equally free. However, going back, thinking also about sort of how these human-animal relations of these vegetarians perhaps were not always great, I think that overwhelmingly, perhaps the worst aspect of these relations that my subjects all fell victim to a greater or lesser extent, is perhaps a sort of naturalistic fallacy. And this sort of manifests itself in ways sometimes that are good, sometimes that are bad, so there's something kind of basic and fundamental going on here, I think. Kingsford's appeal, for example, to vegetarianism as a, quote, ancient diet of our race, and Carpenter's romantic callback to the land are emblematic of this. There's a slippage somewhere wherein they move beyond the ethical or political that should or ought to guide their vegetarianism and into a sort of metaphysical mysticism. It's not simply vitalism, but there is a religious story under the surface here. Both, well, Kingsford herself being highly religious and Carpenter also being highly religious. He was a curate in Cambridge before he left to become an extension lecturer. I think there's this sort of metaphysical mysticism about a human-animal connection sort of manifests itself in my subject's advocacy for sort of alternative health regimens and their anti-vaccination positions as well. This connection between vegetarianism or pre-veganism and the alternative health is long-standing, and these ideas get connected to sort of from the banal sort of Edenic ideas of the innocence of a vegetarian diet through to sort of ideas of meat as corrupting the body, impurity, purity, and they sort of devolve into some quite problematic areas, or at least they can do. And just to sort of end, talk briefly about how this sort of manifests in one of these encounters. So going back to the rook that Kate Salt fostered, there's a really interesting letter between Kate Salt and Edward Carpenter about how after the rook has disappeared, he talks about how she must have really felt this connection, this sort of, he writes about it must have become a sort of personification of nature to you. And he goes into this sort of elaborate understanding about the way in which the human and the animal can be bonded in this sort of universal consciousness and sort of mysticism. And this is sort of juxtaposed against Henry Salt, who's more interested in the dynamic between the two individuals and how she actually learned knowledge from, rather than gaining a sort of metaphysical connection to. And I find that more compelling in Salt's writing than I do in the Carpenter more mystic. Yeah, thank you. That's it.
If anyone has any questions, Chris, come over with the mic now.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm Chris from Leeds University. Thank you. That was a fascinating talk. I just wondered if this is something you've looked at, if you could say anything a bit more about the sort of broader public perception of these figures and the veganism. I think you did kind of touch on that a little bit, but yeah, how was that more broadly seen?
Yeah, they were seen as weirdos and, well, yeah, so I talked about the Faddist's Progress, which was a Times review of his biography, but also, he was also described as a compendium of the cranks, and this goes to his sort of idea that he was connected to all of these different fads, all of these different cranky positions. And there's also an interesting connection between sort of vegetarianism and how it's sort of odd and queer and something that's sort of separate and like this. Yeah, it's also interesting how it's connected at this time to things like women's suffrage. So when suffragettes would get released from prison, they'd often go to a vegetarian restaurant and have a celebratory breakfast, for example. And there's this connection as well, particularly in the late 19th century, with vegetarian restaurants as sort of spaces for socialists, feminists, and sort of agitators, which is an interesting connection. But overwhelmingly in the broader press, yeah, they're seen as oddballs, cranks, faddists, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, to follow on that thread a bit more, yeah, it's something that happens kind of today as well, and I think there's kind of an interesting discussion to have about, like, to what extent should, for example, the animal advocacy movement ally itself with other social justice causes versus going for, like, more mass appeal and things like that. And I was wondering if you had kind of, because you can kind of make a case that it could hurt the movement or it could help the movement, and I wonder if you have any kind of maybe examples from your work where you feel it may have helped or hindered, like.
Yeah. I suppose that's ultimately a personal question, right, in terms of where your veganism comes from. What's the basis? But in terms of, my subjects, it's quite interesting how pragmatic they are actually, thinking about Kingsford. So she was involved in she was obviously very scientific, she gained a medical degree, so she had this MD that she would use, she would publish letters in the 19th century, sort of distinguished periodicals, intellectual periodicals, but then she'd also she was a spiritualist and she'd go to talk to these spiritualist communities and theosophical. So it's quite interesting how it gets tied, but they were quite pragmatic about it. They would change their voice, talking to different audiences. And I think that's just, I think that's vital. You just have to understand your audience, as we've been hearing. But I think generally tying it to other campaigns can help or hinder, can't it? It's case by case. Yeah.
Thank you very much.